So we're going to do our last lesson this morning on restoration. We focused on the need for restoration, the fact that, God says something and eventually we get away from it. We start doing things a different way. I don't know if it's like that game of telephone, things get passed on and passed on. However it is, it's been that way throughout the history of God's involvement with people. And so, since we constantly stray, restoration is needed, and hopefully, I guess you would say, is the norm since it's needed. And so, we saw it in the Old Testament, the New Testament, the Reformation movement, and then we focused on our group of churches, which are part of what's called the Restoration movement. And we looked at all the areas that the Restoration movement has addressed. Baptism is definitely one that always is emphasized, and for good reason. The autonomy of churches, being independent versus having a denominational structure, a plurality of leaders, different things. But then I said, and I would hope that the Bible has shown it to be the case, we stopped too soon. There's a lot of areas that still need restoration. That are just very clearly different from the way the New Testament did it. And this last one we're going to see today definitely has an element of that. We're going to look at what we just looked at, in a sense, what we just did, communion. We are going to talk about what is the biblical model, practice of taking communion, what it's about, and then how do we do it today and how do those differ. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to read, so we can see they'll be up here on the screen again since we're going various places. You'll be flipping back and forth quite a bit. Next week we'll get back to one chunk of scripture that we dig into. First of all, Luke 22, I want to read the main accounts just so they're fresh in our mind. So Luke 22 says, "And when the hour came, Jesus reclined at table and the apostles with him. And he said to them, I have earnestly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. For I tell you, I will not eat it until it is fulfilled in the kingdom of God. And he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he said, Take this and divide it among yourselves. For I tell you that from now on I will not drink of the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of God comes. And he took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to them, saying, This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. And likewise the cup after they had eaten, saying, This is the cup that is poured out for you. This cup that is poured out for you is the new covenant in my blood. Matthew then, chapter 26. Now as they were eating, Jesus took bread, and after blessing it, and gave it to the disciples, and said, Take, eat, this is my body. And he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, turn the page, he gave it to them, saying, Drink of it, all of you, for this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. I tell you, I will not drink again of this fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom. So those are the accounts from the Gospels. And then 1 Corinthians 11, Paul goes into great detail about the Lord's Supper. Verse 17 says, But in the following instructions I do not commend you. So he had talked about some things. He says, here's one not going so well. Because when you come together, it is not for the better, but for the worse. For in the first place, when you come together as a church, I hear that there are divisions among you, and I believe it in part. For there must be factions among you in order that those who are genuine among you may be recognized. When you come together, it is not the Lord's Supper that you eat. For in eating, each one goes ahead with his own meal. One goes hungry, another gets drunk. What? Do you not have houses to eat and drink in? Or do you despise the church of God and humiliate those who have nothing? What shall I say to you? Shall I commend you in this? No, I will not. For I received from the Lord what I also delivered to you, that the Lord Jesus, on the night when he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it, and said, This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me. The same way also he took the cup after supper, saying, This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. Whoever, therefore, eats the bread or drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty concerning the body and blood of the Lord. Let a person examine himself then, and so eat of the bread and drink of the cup. For anyone who eats and drinks without discerning the body eats and drinks judgment on himself. This is why many of you are weak and ill, and some have died. But if we judged ourselves truly, we would not be judged. But when we are judged by the Lord, we are disciplined so that we may not be condemned along with the world. So then, my brothers, when you come together to eat, wait for one another. If anyone is hungry, let him eat at home, so that when you come together, it will not be for judgment. About the other things, I will give directions when I come. All right, so those are the three main passages. We're going to then draw from that as well as some other passages and see what do we need to know about, the first thing, the name. What do we need to know about the Lord's Supper is what the Bible calls it. Paul says it there in Corinthians 11:20. The other names that it's come to be known by are not in the Bible. It doesn't make them wrong. They're not in the Bible. You may have heard it referred to as the Eucharist. That is a Greek word that means thanksgiving. So you can certainly see how that would apply. The one we're probably most familiar with is communion. That is from a Latin word, and it means sharing in common. Sharing in common. So those are the names. Holy Communion often gets mentioned because of, just the fact of what it is. But that is what the Bible calls it and what it's come to be called. The one big thing to look at is the purpose. What is the purpose of the Lord's Supper, of communion? Luke chapter 22, Jesus said, "Do this in remembrance of me." So that obviously is the key. In 1 Corinthians 11, just to read some of those verses again, Paul says, "I received from the Lord what I also delivered to you, that the Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, took bread. When he had given thanks, he broke it and said, 'This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me.' In the same way, he also took the cup after supper, saying, 'This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it, in remembrance of me.'" So that's where Paul gets at. He's keying on that idea that Jesus put forth. What's that mean? In remembrance of Jesus. Just what it says. Anything specific we are to remember about Jesus?
He died for us.
Yeah, I think that's the key that it is. That Jesus, what Jesus did to bring about forgiveness. His whole life led up to that. But I think that's the key that he's talking about there. Do this in remembrance of what I'm about to go do. You remember when he instituted it, and right before he was arrested. And I think it also, as we think about it, as we think about Jesus' death, we need to remember both the blessings it brings and definitely the responsibilities. That Paul brings out in Romans that, Jesus not only died for sin, he died to sin, and we're to do the same thing. And so that element, where it talks about work out your salvation with fear and trembling. Jesus brought about salvation. I need to live a life that reflects. I've been saved as a result of the death of the Son of God. And God offering that freely for me. Now, I will add another part here as we seek to, somewhat restore the biblical mindset. What this doesn't mean, the purpose of the Lord's Supper or communion, it is not an extra dose of grace or forgiveness. I can remember having this idea. I can remember many times hearing this idea that there's something that happens here, and I think it comes from the fact that this is called a sacrament, and in different denominations, a sacrament is a means of conveying God's grace. And so it's come to be thought of as we get a little extra grace here. No, there's nothing in the Bible that says that. And as a matter of fact, if that's what we were remembering, we'd really be remembering the inadequacy of Jesus' sacrifice on the cross. We'd be saying, Jesus, you did a lot, but you didn't do enough, so I need an extra shot every week. A little bit extra, a booster shot of grace. Well, again, that'd basically be saying, Jesus, you didn't do enough on the cross. So that is not at all what this time is. It's remembering what Jesus did, and part of that should be remembering he did everything that was needed, everything that was required. Is there anything else regarding purpose?
It's a new covenant.
That's what he started with his death, absolutely.
It's for us as a people to do together.
It is for us. That's one thing we're going to see is how it was done. In 1 Corinthians 11:26, Paul says one other thing. He says, "For as often as you eat this bread and drink the cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." You proclaim the Lord's death. What's that mean?
You're saying it's going to happen.
Well, his death
It happened.
did happen. So you're saying that happened until he comes. That comes back. That's a part of the reason. And that's also one of the things when it talks about Jesus' death, very often it's talking not only about the death, but about the full, event that encompassed that, which is his resurrection too. And Jesus' death in and of itself is nothing to celebrate if he hadn't been resurrected. But the resurrection of Jesus was God's stamp of approval. What he said was true. What he did really happened. He brought about forgiveness. And so we're stating the significance of that. Who are we proclaiming it to?
The world.
The world, okay? Each other. How are we proclaiming it to the world? Did the world see what happened here?
See a parking lot full of cars.
They do. And they know that this is one of the things. So it's both. You're proclaiming it to each other. It's a reminder for each other. It'd be a proclamation for anyone who is present, who is not a believer, that, we are proclaiming, we believe the Son of God died for sins, rose from the dead, and we share in that as people who have made a commitment to that. You're proclaiming it to the world in the sense that Christians definitely became characterized for taking the Lord's Supper. Sometimes in a negative way, it was misunderstood. We're going to talk about that, where Jesus said, "This is my body and this is my blood." They became accused of cannibalism. But the world knew this is part of what Christians do. And so in that sense, it is a proclamation. And it's a proclamation that, again, when you take everything all together, Jesus did die for sins and he rose from the dead. And we celebrate that. Any questions on any of this?
We're not going to give it up either. We're going to keep it going.
Until he comes. Yeah. There you go.
And we'll do it in heaven. Like he said that
I will not eat
together
it.
until.
Right. So, yeah, what will happen in heaven, certainly still be a time to celebrate how we get here in the first place.
It also shows that his kingdom is in us.
That it has already started in some sense. It's already, but not yet.
It's also remembrance.
Right. Yeah, that's the key one. Do this in remembrance of me.
There are actual historical references to the Christians, and that was the reference was that this group, they came together for a meal of remembrance every first day of the week, and that's basically how they describe it.
That's what they were known for.
So that
Yeah.
does proclaim
What are they?
history.
Yeah. What are they remembering? Yeah. So that's the other sense of that we remember it, but it's also in doing it we're proclaiming.
Well, he's our king, so we're in his kingdom.
Absolutely. Well, let's look at some other things, and then we'll get to how it was taken and different things. The nature of the bread and juice. I mentioned this one because sometimes there's some questions, because there are some different views, whether maybe you've heard the big name, maybe you've just heard the idea. One view of, what is it that we have here? When, the bread and the juice, when we take it, what is it? One view is called transubstantiation. This will be on the quiz, so you want to write this down. Spelling does count. Transubstantiation. The way I remember this is the bread and the juice are mystically, spiritually transformed into the actual body and blood of Christ. That it now is transformed into that. Now you could run a test on it in a scientific lab and it would still show it's bread and juice. But this is the belief of Catholics, Eastern and Oriental Orthodox, that it now has been transformed into. Another view, which is like a step down, is consubstantiation. And again, remember that it mystically contains the body and blood of Christ. And that would be Lutherans and Episcopalians believe that. My view is non-substantiation. Jesus was speaking symbolically when he said, "This is my body and this is my blood." In another part, of the Gospels, he says, "I am the door." You know, was he saying I'm made of wood? No. He was speaking symbolically, and I believe that's what he was doing with the elements of the Passover that he was using.
I mean, if they really wanted to get real technical, it was that specific bread at that one and only time.
One and only time.
Yeah.
Which, that's the other thing. The bread and juice, realize that communion, and I think we all know, comes from the Passover. That's what Jesus was doing when he instituted what we call the Lord's Supper or communion. They were celebrating the Passover. That celebration of what God did in Egypt to release the children of Israel from slavery in Egypt, where the angel of death passed over and they put the blood on their door frames, and God said, you know, while that night you need to be, you know, eating this meal, and you need to be eating unleavened bread because you have to go in a hurry. And then God made it clear. It wasn't just the Jews' idea. He made it clear, I want you to celebrate this every year. And they developed different traditions around it, the cups and things like that. Now, so it, you know, what's that mean? Well, the nature of the bread and juice, the bread is to be unleavened. That's what comes from the Passover. And again, leaven is yeast. It's what causes dough to rise, but it takes a while. God said, you don't have a while. So unleavened bread. And they make a point of it now, you know, Jews who celebrate the Passover. You know, they look to get all the leaven out of the house. What about the juice? This question comes up. Was it grape juice or was it the W word? Wine. Welch's, there you go. The other W word.
You know, there is a story about the Welch's. The original Welch guy, canning became available, you know, and so without preservation, fresh fruit juice of any sort almost immediately starts fermenting. So in order to keep it, you know, from doing that, canning was invented, you know, preservative. And Welch said, you know, there's a lot of teetotalers in the church that don't want to, I mean, in other words, the only time you can have fresh grape juice was during the season. And after that, it was starting to ferment, you know, immediately. So he said, I'm going to use the new way of preservation and start canning grape juice so churches can have that available.
Can have fresh grape juice all the time.
Right.
Well, should the church be, well, did Jesus, was it juice or was it wine? Again, I've heard, you know, the argument I heard that it was juice was that, you know, that similar to the leaven in the bread, what makes juice ferment is something like yeast, and so you couldn't have that because it wasn't supposed to be anywhere. You know, what did they do? You know, Paul talked about it in Corinthians. They, you know, you get drunk. Well, that probably means it was wine. And Orthodox Jews still use wine. They just use kosher wine, which I read and forget exactly what makes it kosher. So chances are it was wine.
We did a little bit on that at the Miracle of Canaan and did some research. And they did have a concentrate that they could use to make grape juice. But even if, so they couldn't intentionally ferment it with yeast, obviously. But if it did turn, they watered it down to a point that, and it was considered uncouth, actually, to drink wine that hadn't been watered down. And so we have historical records of that. If there was alcohol in it, you're like, you know,
See, I've heard that too.
Infinitesimal,
But
you're not going to get drunk.
I've heard that too, but the problem is with that, you know, that's what I heard, you know, coming up in my conservative Florida Christian college. Like, there was no leeway given at all to could be alcohol of any concentration. But the master of the ceremony says, you kept the good wine till last. There is no such thing as good wine if you take wine and water it down 10 to 1. Like, you're not going to know what
If
it started with.
Well, I've never tasted
the
good
history
wine.
of the time demonstrates that was the common practice. Now, obviously, I wasn't there.
I know. I've heard that too, but I've heard other
I would
things.
also say this, that I don't believe that Jesus would contribute intentionally to drunkenness.
I don't believe he would contribute to drunkenness, but was that, again, was it wine, and was there a limit? You know, it talks in the Old Testament about wine makes glad the heart. In what sense? So I've heard both. I've heard that too. I just always, again, from someone who, I'll admit, has drank wine. There is some good wine, there is some bad wine, but you take it and water it down 10 to 1, you are going to know. So how did the master of the ceremony come and say?
Actually, as a means of quenching.
And even then, when he says, you know, how did, you know, most people save the good wine, you know, serve the good wine first and take the bad wine. Why? Well, because they understand that people have probably gotten a little tipsy and don't recognize that, oh, this wine's not as good as the other. I mean, that's just a fact.
Well, there's several problems. One is that during 1611, when King James, you know, authorized the translation in the English language, like look up in the Strong's Concordance, you're supposed to have every word in the Bible. How many have found grape juice in Strong's Concordance?
Right, it definitely says wine. What did that mean? And the idea was new wine versus old wine. I mean, I've heard that, and I don't know for sure. I'm just, when I hear the arguments, that's my response
But I mean,
to the arguments. That
does that mean,
it doesn't seem to fit some of the things.
does that mean that Welch invented grape juice?
Well, again, there was grape, any of it started as grape juice. But when Paul says you get drunk, obviously there's probably wine there. And, you know, for them to say, most people save the good wine till, you know, start with the good wine instead of bringing it out last, I think the implication is when people aren't as aware of what's good and bad. I don't know how to take that any other way.
I like, now, see, the English language only had the word wine, even for grape juice. You know, it's fresh squeezed grapes, that's called wine. And only, that word grape juice only developed later. So when they translated in the Bible, even grape juice, it had to be wine, because that's the only word the English had for that. Also, it wasn't until the 1400s, I think it was, that distillation was invented. And that originally was invented for perfumes, to make odors stronger. Some guy thought, hey, we can up the alcohol content.
Apply that to alcohol?
To apply that to alcohol.
I didn't know that history.
Just natural fermentation. You'd have to drink a lot of it, which a lot of people did, but it was way less, I think about 5%.
Right, now what was the alcohol level? That would be interesting, you know, of that.
It doesn't mention the wine is still in the cluster, so it'd have to be still.
So the word was you. Yeah, there's definitely a word like new wine. Again, the context of some verses are what make me say the implication is there's some alcohol there. You know, if save the wine and getting drunk on, you know, what Paul just said, you come and get drunk. Now, were they drinking wine before and then they switched to juice for communion? Because they went from the agape feast into wine? And this was not like, I've got just a little bit here. It was not to make a big discussion on this one, just to say, you know, was it or not?
What difference does it make as long as we're doing it, taking this fluid in remembrance of God?
That's definitely the main element that's there. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
With the right part.
Absolutely. And I don't know of any church that uses wine. It's just, what did Jesus have?
And it's our
What were they using?
responsibility to not be a drunkard or a glutton or all that kind of stuff. I mean, it is somewhat on us to.
What to do with it and how much to
Well,
take.
obviously, the Corinthians were drinking some kind of alcoholic beverage, because it said you guys are getting drunk.
Because you're getting drunk, yeah. So that context, whether it's the meal started with wine, did they switch to something else? You know, we were drinking
One would
wine.
assume that they were partying that hard and some of them were getting full, they probably weren't just eating the unleavened bread either. They had just turned it into a party.
Right, well, but it seems like it did start with a meal. You know, they were having a real meal,
Yeah.
and then it was, I mean, and the intention wasn't, like, don't say this one in a bad way, like the intention was, it just sort of, okay, it culminated in, let's remember the Lord's Supper. So, and we saw that in Acts, the whole breaking of bread, you know, in Acts 2:42, we want to call it communion, but then in Acts like 2:48, it's clear it's talking about a meal. Well, Corinth shows they were put together. They would come for a meal. The problem in Corinth was, again, what I've always heard, the rich, they could get off early from work because they didn't really work. Again, this whole middle class thing is a new invention. There were rich and there were poor. People who worked and people who didn't, to a large degree. And so they could get there early. They had plenty of food. Well, the poorer people, they couldn't get there till later. They didn't have a lot of food, and all the food was gone because all the rich people ate it and drank it. And so Paul's saying, yeah, if your main focus is just to eat, do that at home.
And you gotta remember that the original context was a Passover meal. It wasn't a Passover snack.
Right, yeah, they came out of a whole Passover meal. Now, Jesus took two elements from that. Took the bread and took one of the cups. I believe they have 4 cups in the Passover. He took one of those cups. And again, that's what the Jews had developed over the years, because the original Passover was not that elaborate, the meal. It was them just having a meal. You're getting ready to leave, eat some unleavened bread, and go. Linda has something over here.
We look at this issue from a post-temperance movement point of view when we cleaned up our act. Prior to that, the use of wine was very common. And to illustrate that, I was reading some old church records from this congregation back in the 1870s and 80s, and they were discussing the finances that they needed for the whole year and how much each person had to contribute to do it. And the list of the expenses, one specific item was purchase wine.
So, the history of the church even, this church. Yeah. No, I don't know of any modern churches that do it, but I do know if I've been to Passovers. And when Passover one was actually led by, Jewish Christians, that was, they gave the option so people could do whatever they wanted, but, you could have kosher wine or you could have grape
If it
juice.
was in season, you couldn't even get grape juice.
Well, yeah, until the distillation. All right, I'm going to move on from that.
Come on.
We didn't spend that much time on transubstantiation and consubstantiation. How was the Lord's Supper taken? This is the one I want to focus on. What was the dynamic? What did it look like? And we talked about that some. But let's look at what we know. Again, Jesus initiated it from the Passover meal. Yeah, and we know from the painting there were 13 people on one side of the table, and they all... Yeah. We do know they were there. Jesus and the apostles, it says that. So, and that's how it was anyway. You would get together. It wasn't, there was no one that did a Passover meal by themselves. You would get together with people and celebrate this Passover. And so it was a group of people. Again, who's ever participated in a Passover meal?
We did once.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very interesting to see, again, it's the, tradition, and by Jesus' time it had developed, that they, had and I forget all the things, but the 4 cups, one's the cup of Elijah and different things like that. So yeah, it's very interesting to see what the Jews were doing in Jesus' time, what Jesus was probably doing. So that's where he started, in this group meal setting. The Corinthian observance, again, it flowed out of an actual meal, came to be known as the agape feast, the love feast. What's the dynamic of a group meal? Yeah, you got people. What are they doing?
Talking and enjoying food.
Yeah, until the food comes, and then this conversation goes down a little bit, everybody's eating, but yeah, they're all interacting, they're eating. And the alternative name, communion. It means sharing in common. Now again, that's not a biblical name, but why did people describe it that? Why did they call it the Eucharist? Well, it is a time of thanksgiving. We're thankful for what Jesus did. It makes total sense. Well, someone else called it communion. Why? Well, because you have this community meal. You have this community celebration. All right, what does the Lord's Supper look like today?
Me and God.
Me and God.
I know something, not even a snack, are they?
You don't get a lot, do you? Yeah, it is very individual. It is me and God. It's very quiet. Communion is when you get quiet. Again, I remember, growing up at Georgetown, the music for communion, very, very calm. Then the offering came, you could rip it up a little bit, You could turn up the volume, turn up the tempo, but communion had to be very. Is that any, is that the group meals, I'm serving? Now, again, what change went from, the meal part to as it becomes communion? But still, it was that group, it was taken in a group. It was, that, as I've said before, that dynamic of it was we and God, not me and God, that we've switched to.
It was a shared cup.
Yeah, well, it's what we think. Pass the cup. At what point did they begin using more than one? As you got a certain group of people, was there more than one? Any question or doubt, the Lord's Supper has changed since the New Testament. I don't think we can say, the dynamic has drastically changed from a group of people celebrating as a group to a group of people, but we're doing it individually. And so, again, I look at this, and the agitator in me says, why is that okay?
Well, I think it changed some during the New Testament, probably. When we have them, immediately they're everywhere to go, and they're doing it. And then you see in Corinthians what it had become. And so I think somewhere in there, that's when the apostles, somebody said, hey, let's tone this down a little bit and make it, I don't think like we have it today, but I think at some point it became separate from a meal.
It definitely became separate. When did it?
I think initially it was the meal. And I think at some point they had to separate that to stop what was happening in 1 Corinthians. So you'll see the church first, on the day of Pentecost, there's not really any structure. And then eventually somebody said, do it like this. Because they all did it they all did it. They all came together on the first day of the week, and all that stuff became part of the tradition. I think somebody told them that. Eventually.
So would you call that earlier than the love feast, or after the love feast it was sort of?
It's hard to say because we're not told exactly. We just see it begin to change. And so Paul says to keep the traditions of the apostles, both written and spoken. This one's not written, but it must have been spoken because the churches all over in every country, continent, and city seem to be doing it.
Right. I mean, from the very beginning, when you look at the Acts chapter 2, and just the fact that they use breaking of bread for both, seems to imply it was a meal, it was what we call communion. And then you have Corinth, and then at some point it stopped. When did it stop?
Well, that's what it fascinates me, is that I can find no record of exactly how they did it and what I've been able to look through.
And did it?
It does seem to have been toned down and become, I hate to say more formal, but certainly more structured, I think.
Was, and I guess part of my question would be, did that happen with the move from a house dynamic to a, whatever you want to call, cathedral dynamic, where people went from a setting that you assume in a house, when you're in a house, you're not in rows like this and such. You get to church and you are, and did that switch, it seemed like that switched the look of, not the look of, the way communion was viewed. As the one person who traced the history when we talked about worship said it became like a sacrifice, which meant you had an altar, which meant you had priests, and the whole idea sort of evolved around that. Yeah, I don't think we can, certainly Paul is toning down Corinth. He's saying, yeah, that's wrong. Wild party, wild out of control party, and then, hey, let's have a God moment. That's not the way to do it. But the idea of, we're eating together and that's a part of our gathering, that seems to go back to, Acts 2:42. I think Corinth in general is basically, the whole book is, here's the way you're supposed to do it. You guys are taking it to an extreme. The tongue speaking, we're of Paul, the divisions, and, as we go on other things. Basically, Corinth is a list of, you guys took a good thing to an extreme and made it bad. And so they definitely did that. But the good part is, I think we have to remember that it was we and God. It was a communion. And not just me communing with God, it was us communing with each other.
Well, that's well and good to do it as a gathering, but if I'm homesick, sick at home, I can have communion with God, there's nobody else around.
Absolutely. I'm going to talk about that in just a second.
You don't have communion with yourself.
I know it's kind of hard to sort all this New Testament stuff out, but there's people, David Rousseau is one of them, that he's got a book out called The Dictionary of Early Christian Writings. And he took all the way from the earliest, like Irenaeus and Polycarp, I think, like 110 AD, all the way up to 325, the Nicene Council, all those writings that we have available. And say, well, how did they understand the apostolic teaching? And it did seem that it was very, very common that it was a meeting, and they participated in the remembrance aspect of Christ's death, his body and his blood, incorporated in that meal, just like they did in the Passover meal.
Right. Yeah, and so there's definitely value to that because they're closer to the New Testament times than we are. So you see the early church fathers. What about, how does this impact taking communion if not present at the gathering? Like I said, there's nothing wrong with it. But I will say this, might get in trouble with this one too. I don't believe it's meant to be a formality that, you got to check, if I'm sick on a Sunday and can't make it here, well, I've got to take communion somehow. Because I see those same people who, well, do you have to listen to a sermon? Do you have to spend some time in prayer? Do you have to, there's certainly no fellowship going on if you're homesick. We've said that Acts 2:42 is not an order of service for the early church, but it's definitely what we base, what should we do when we're together as Christians? And, those are 4 key things.
It's a commandment.
Well, again, the whole thing is. So if you're not here, do you listen to a sermon? And maybe some people do, But what I'm saying is don't make this one. Here's the thing I disagree with some. I don't believe that communion, on that list of Acts 2:42, the apostles' doctrine, the breaking of bread, the fellowship, and the prayers, I don't see one that's highlighted or asterisk that says this is the most important one of the group. I know, but I hear people often, I have Jerry Paul, someone I respect a lot. He says that one's more important. I don't see anywhere that says that one is the most important of.
Well, the phrase that they came together on the first day of the week to break bread suggests that might have been the primary thing. But as far as missing it when you're sick, it was set up as Passover, at Passover. And Passover was commanded under threat of death. But if you were on a long trip, if you were sick, there were reasons that you could miss the Passover. And even actually there was a setup for if you missed the Passover, like a makeup day.
Makeup day,
if you missed
okay.
the Passover. So, there were plenty of reasons, even with the death penalty, there were plenty of reasons why you could miss the Passover. So, I think you're right that we put this, we kind of got it wrong in the formality that we put to it, and that it is we and God considerably stronger than it is me and God. So there should be some me and God involved.
Yeah, you can't have we and God without me and God. If I don't have a relationship with God, then I can't be part of the group.
There was a time when I would have said, like many people do, that, whoa, man, when I go on vacation, I gotta take, and I don't see anything wrong with taking it when you go on vacation or whatever. You should remember. But I think we have turned it into something that it wasn't.
Yeah, I don't, and this is in my notes, I'm not diminishing the importance of communion. I'm just saying don't turn it into something that, I got to do that one, especially if you're not doing the others that are typically part of a Sunday gathering.
Yeah, that probably comes out of
It turns it into a formality.
that kind of thought probably comes out of the memory of the sacramental thinking.
Yeah, that it's a way of getting an extra dose of grace. That could be. But again, when you look at the what constitutes a worship gathering, a gathering, they're all important. They're all. I mean, that one definitely is. But how do we know what communion is without the apostles' doctrine? And definitely, prayer and fellowship is that unity Jesus prayed. That they might all be one. That's the Lord's true prayer. So they're all important. To make this one like it's above others, and I've got to do that one even if I don't do anything else. One other note on this. Let me do. I'll also say this because it's developed. Elders are not required to make it official. If you want to take it at home, it doesn't have to be an elder that gives it to you. It doesn't have to be anyone that gives it to you. You can have that moment with God. Matter of fact, to whatever degree you can. I mean, how sick is sick? There's times where, like, I ain't having nothing. I'm on death's door, and so there'll be no, sermon, fellowship, anything. But if for whatever reason I just can't get there, to have that moment with God, fine. That can just be you.
It doesn't have to be on Sunday or first day of the week. You can take it anytime you feel a need.
There you go. You are good at transitioning me, because the next one is, how often should we take it? Acts chapter 20. On the first day of the week, when we gathered together to break bread. So there you have that. And again, and you see there, you gathered together to break bread. Now that probably would have included the meal. So, how, to make communion the most important, but say, well, we can get rid of that meal that they had. But it's making it clear they did it on the first day of the week. And so, excuse me. I may need my water.
Getting some wine.
Yeah. Oh, was out in the barn yesterday, got a little dust. Okay.
That wine in there?
Oh. And it's not coffee. Everyone always thinks I have coffee. I never have coffee.
Yeah, right.
I have water. So yeah, to take it less often than once a week, I don't see. Oh, I'm sorry. I don't see how you could take it less than once a week. And again, many churches do. Maybe once a month they'll take it, or once a quarter. The Bible's pretty clear about that. And that's one of the things, again, we as the Restoration Movement look, we've restored that. Look, and I absolutely agree. That's great that we've restored it. What about some of the other parts of communion and other things? Acts 2, we read this. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, the fellowship, breaking of bread, and prayers. And then verse 46, and day by day, attending the temple together and breaking bread in their homes, they received their food with glad and generous hearts. That would seem to indicate, if breaking of bread means the same thing 4 verses later, that they got together and it included, what we would call communion or the Lord's Supper. So more often than once a week. So certainly nothing wrong with taking it. As a matter of fact, I'd go so far as to say there's no prohibition for taking it more than once a day. I remember the old habit, and maybe you remember this too, from churches, when there were Sunday night services. What did you do for the people who missed Sunday morning? They came forward and sat on the front row, and someone would give them communion, but all the rest of the people, would just watch them. Because you can't take communion more than once a day. Where do some of these ideas come from? There's nothing, matter of fact, it diminishes what communion is, because it emphasizes that fact. It's me and God. So I have to make sure I take it, but we can't take it together again. And that's what I'm saying. You get away from the meaning, and over years, traditions develop, and you don't even realize we're missing the point. And I think that was really missing the point. Who can take communion? Here's this. Which word? Can or should? Should only Christians take communion?
Well, non-Christian don't even know who
to some degree. Now, doesn't mean they don't know anything about Jesus, because they haven't made a commitment yet. And here's the thing, I remember at Scottsdale Christian Church, and I was helped draft it, we had a statement in the bulletin that said, this is for baptized believers. Some churches go so far as, I remember reading an article about Methodist Church of the Missouri Synod. It's only for Missouri Synod Methodists. It's not even if you're a Methodist from another synod, because we don't know what you might believe, so don't take our communion. If non-Christians were present for the Agape Feast, and Paul does mention that, the Agape Feast was part of their Sunday gathering, and he talks about if they're, in the portion on tongues and prophecy, if a non-Christian is there and hears this, they'll, fall down and worship. Did those people, you think, participate in the communion part of the Agape Feast?
What's the one to eat?
Did they stop after that? I don't know. Here's what often comes up. 1 Corinthians 11 says, whoever therefore eats the bread or drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty concerning the body and blood of the Lord. Let a person examine himself then, and so eat of the bread and drink of the cup. For anyone who eats and drinks without discerning the body eats and drinks judgment on himself. That's usually where it comes from. But, my thought is the context, when you look at this, Paul is not talking about people who aren't Christians and then that's what makes you unworthy. He's talking about Christians who are not acting in a loving manner. He said, here you are celebrating Jesus' greatest gift of love. For God so loved the world that he gave his only son, and you're doing it in an unloving manner. That's wrong, Paul said, and that's what he's talking about there. The other thing that came to mind later for me, non-Christians are already under God's judgment. If you're not a Christian, you are not going to heaven. The Bible makes it clear, you will spend eternity separate from God. Is there going to be something in hell where they ask, how many times did you take communion? If so, we're going to make it a little worse. I don't think so. So I don't think there's anything wrong, if there's a group and we pass out communion, I don't think there's any reason to say you aren't allowed to take this. If it helps a person, if they're taking it, helps open their eyes to what it is, great.
What about children?
I'd say the same thing for children. Again, sometimes that'll happen in junior church, okay, you can take it, you can't.
I think in the church where people know the difference, I think it should be reserved for baptized believers. But for visitors, what we always had in the bulletin where my dad was it's the Lord's table, it's not our table. We're not going to deny, or we're not going to force, and we're not going to deny. It's between you and God.
So I guess my thought would be there, what's the difference, when does a visitor become a person it falls into the non-Christian category?
I would hope that they came enough times they would hear and learn.
Right.
So at some point they're going to realize, wait, this isn't for me. But certainly I don't think the church ought to be going around, no. Now, if you've got kids in the church, their parents should be teaching them. You would hope they would know. But I don't think it's up to us to ban people from taking it like the Catholics say, oh, no, you can't have it this week. I don't think that's up to us. I think that's between them and God. I don't think we'll be picking and choosing.
I guess the thought when it comes to kids for me is, part of it is when is a person, a child old enough to make a true decision? I think they're old enough to recognize the importance of Jesus and his sacrifice before they're ready to make a commitment. So in that sense, and recognize there is no biblical, we're trying to take biblical principles. There's no biblical precedent that says, well, at Corinthian Love Feast, anyone under 12 was not allowed to, We're trying to follow principles. For a child to take communion, say in junior church, I would have no problem with, because it is them realizing there's something that's very important being remembered here. There's even something very important being done here. And they're being taught that when they become a Christian, which again, I say, and there's a whole other discussion, should be later than when they understand Jesus and what he did is important. That comes pretty early versus I'm ready to make a commitment to it. So I wouldn't have a problem with that.
Could be part of proclamation. part, the idea of.
They're proclaiming that. Again, and they can even remember it. They can remember what it is before they absolutely understand it. That's certainly where a non-Christian would be. So, again, that's where there's no set teaching. That's where I would come down on it. Who can serve communion? We talked about this a little bit last week. There's no New Testament example or practice. It isn't leading, so I'd say anyone can serve communion. Again, the New Testament church didn't have rows where people were, sitting in like this. I brought this up last week. In fact, I was just going to go over that. A bonus. Oh, well, I did, because, all right. Because the next one related to this. Who can give a communion meditation? We brought this up last week when we talked about women leading. One thing, it is not a biblical elder role. That used to be one of the thoughts. Who can do a communion? Well, an elder, of course. That's the only one who can do it. It's their chance to get up and give a pre-sermon. No. Certainly not that. There's no New Testament example or practice. I shared last week, if you weren't here, it's not inherently teaching. To me, it's a thought about Jesus' sacrifice. There are elements, you could be teaching in it, okay. And then this comes down to, again, certainly I think most would agree it doesn't have to be an elder. The question that came up last week is, does it have to be a man versus a woman? And one thought that came up is, at the moment, the person is leading the thoughts, and I know that was really good. But if a woman prays, a woman is leading the thoughts at that moment. And it does say in 1 Corinthians 11:5 that women did pray in church. So at that moment, they were leading the thoughts. Is that leading the church? I think we have to watch that word leading. Again, if a woman's leading the song service, is she leading in the sense that Paul says he doesn't permit? I don't think so. So where's communion meditation fall on it? Again, they're leading the thought. As long as they're not teaching, they are leading the thoughts, but they're doing that when they're praying.
I think as long as you got men that's willing to do it, that's the way it ought to be. If you don't have enough men step forward, I think it's a situation.
All right, and again, my thought on this is we're seeking restoration, because this is what, and here's what happens, and if you've ever talked to other people about other things, they say this, the same thing that we say about things that are different that we're doing. Well, other people say the same thing about baptism. Other people say the same thing about how often to take the Lord's Supper. Other people say the same thing about one pastor versus elders. Well, I think if you do this, okay, what's the Bible say? What's the Bible say? And let's try, and sometimes it's not exactly specified, so what are the principles indicating? But just, that would be my thought. Be real careful of, this is the way we've always done it, or I think this, because people will say the same thing. I think you need to be immersed. Well, I think sprinkling is good enough.
Where in the Bible does it say you have to have communion meditation?
Right. Did they even have communion meditations?
I'm with you, Martha.
Yeah. No, that's what I said last week.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, that's fine, and that's why I'm repeating it this week. They went from a meal and somehow, it culminated in communion. Was there, did someone stop and have a meditation? I don't know that they did. If so, did they just read, what they had, once they had some reading?
Okay, I grew up Presbyterian Methodist, okay. And they always blessed the elements. They don't do that here.
Well, that's what they're turning them.
Did that.
They're turning them into, again, Presbyterian would fall into one of the groups that it mystically contains the body and blood of Jesus once they do that. Because it doesn't come from the store that way. So they say the right words over it. That's when it now mystically contains. Yeah.
All right, I think that Jesus blessed the bread.
He blessed the bread.
It kind of depends on what you mean by blessed bread. I would think, when they say before you pray, before you eat anything, they have to bless, they ask a blessing or whatever. So I think that's a little less formal probably than to where you have to have some certain person say some certain words before you can do it.
Right, because typically, again, it's what we do, but typically there's a prayer before communion, in that sense, a blessing. But it's not an official, again, in those it would be an official whether they, I don't, I've been to a Catholic service maybe once, I can't remember. I remember I was told by my friend, you can't have this. I got up so she could get out, and she's like, no, you can't take it. I'm like, no, I'm just letting you out. I know I'm, the unclean. But
Yeah.
they said words that, again, had, in their mind, had that effect.
Yeah.
I'm thinking though, like we do potluck, and we talk about anything under the sun, right? But for the actual communion meditation, we're all meditating together, and if you turn it into a potluck, then what is the significance of that?
No, it wasn't turned into a potluck. It came out, if you want to view it that way, it came out of the potluck. Theirs would be that potluck would be part of the service, and at some point, they celebrated the Lord's Supper. They specifically did things that, this is versus whatever they were eating before. This is the bread, this is the juice. We're doing it in remembrance of Jesus.
And
So-
they kept it on track and not getting off track. And it-
My guess is.
Well, Corinth,
They started out with a paragraph or less, and then turned into 15-minute
yeah, mini sermon.
mini sermons, yeah.
Yeah. So we don't know what did they do to transition. Everything we see from Acts 2 and then Corinth and Paul in 1 Corinthians 11 says they were eating a meal and it culminated in communion, a specific bread and cup.
So like before
What
everybody,
we don't know
before everybody headed home.
Yeah, we don't know how they did it.
Leave, let's have communion.
Yeah, we don't know how they did it. Did they say anything at all? Did you say you have to say something? Did they read a specific thing? Once they had the account of Jesus, did they read that? We don't know. But it was separate from. It wasn't like communion was the potluck. It was the culmination of the potluck.
A lot of the early restoration leaders' thoughts about communion came as a reaction to the formality of churches, clergy-centered churches, where some went so far as to issue a check to people before that would allow them to take communion. So they centered on the concept of open communion, where the decision was the participant rather than the clergy.
Than the person, they were allowed. There were churches, it was very formal. I said that, again, the part I was going to throw out. Because I thought I'll throw this in. I've been talking in, if you still want me to, you got to let me know. Do a little workshop on communion meditations. But here's my, quick bullet summary on what makes a good communion meditation, in my opinion. Again, it's not like I have some Bible verse. One thought, one passage, 2 to 3 minutes. One thought, and this is any time you speak. You should be able to summarize if you're writing or speaking formally, you should be able to summarize it in a sentence. We've been going on for a long time here, and, we interact so it goes further. But you could summarize this sermon as our modern practice of communion is different than the New Testament practice. Everything I've said today falls under that. You should always, if you're speaking or writing, you should always be able to summarize it in a sentence, because that makes what you're going to say clear. Everything I say should support that sentence. One passage, not necessarily one verse, but one passage that you read. If you want us to turn to, okay, give us time to do it, but definitely flipping back and forth is going to get distracting. If there's something else you need to say that supports it, sort of cite that verse versus, well, let me turn and read this passage. And then 2 to 3 minutes. It's meant just to give us a fresh perspective, an attempt at a fresh perspective on something we do every week. It's not meant to be a pre-sermon or a post-sermon or a second sermon, as maybe you've encountered at places. And I'm not saying that, that's certainly not here. I've seen it much, much different at other places. So that's my thoughts on that. So to close today, I like to do the observation, reflection, and application. Observation. The purpose of the Lord's Supper is to remember Jesus' atoning sacrifice. And the dynamic, and this is the big thing that's missing, is a shared experience. And so you reflect on that. That's what we observed. The Lord's Supper is meant to be a time of shared remembrance of Jesus' sacrifice and what it means for us, both the blessings and responsibilities. That shared remembrance. So the application is, how can we restore that shared aspect of celebrating the Lord's Supper today? How can we, because it's shifted, we all agree, to a very me and God focus, how can we get back some of that we and God focus? And this is one thing what next week's brainstorming is going to be for all of these sermons. You know, how do we restore the biblical focus of prayer? How do we get back to, participation? All those things we've talked about for 9 weeks. Well, maybe this is just to prime the pump, or maybe you have some ideas already. How do we get back to that group dynamic of communion?
I've been in churches where, and you probably all have too, where like you hold it and everybody takes at the same time. So, take the bread together, take the juice together.
Yep. I think it's still very individual, but it's doing it at the same time. So there's some step that direction.
At different communions, different places. Now the Catholics, of course, I can't take their communion, but they will bless you as you go through it, which is, it's interesting. But most of the churches, I don't think ours Methodists did it all the time, but you would stand, and then you come forward, and then you walk in front. Now, a lot of times they have a big loaf of bread there, and they break off pieces. Then you take that and you dip it in the juice, and then you ate that, and it does a couple of things. It brings you forward. In other words, by going and doing this, what you're saying to other people, especially those who don't believe that are in the attendance, is that this is what I am. I am a Christian. I believe in Jesus Christ. And when you come up publicly,
So there's a proclamation element.
so you got a proclamation that you are doing this, and then of course by taking the elements, you were doing what you were told to do. You were told to do this in remembrance.
Okay.
And I think that, to me, that's one of the most important things about it. Now, of course, like in a Catholic church, they don't. But the only thing you're going to get from them with that would be a blessing of a sort. And the other thing I have to say is, on the wine, I don't see how the wine of that day could not have some alcohol in it.
Well, it had, everyone agrees it had some.
Yeah,
Unless it was the fresh juice.
The very element of grapes or whatever, you have this gray fermenting on the outside of the grape, which is going to get into it, and there's going to be some.
So everyone would agree that there was some.
Yeah,
It's
but
how
I think
much?
I personally, it's my own thing. To me, it's a very personal thing, and you're supposed to self-reflect. What you were doing.
Well, remember, Paul, and that's the other thing I brought out at some point, not today, I remember it was in some notes. Paul's whole thing about the self-reflection, that's before you get there.
Yes, and this is all a part of it. Yes.
To even, should you even be taking it? Paul, that's what Paul's self-reflection is. Should I be taking it? And, and his main focus was, have I been a jerk to other people? I shouldn't be taking it. If I'm not showing love to other people, I shouldn't then enter into do this action, which is all about Jesus' love for us and his sacrifice. So it's, that self-reflection is before you take it. It's not, and we've turned it into, while you're taking it, you need to reflect on, and that's different. The closest I've seen to a group dynamic is the church we went to was actually in New Haven. And they had the second, and you'll see, I've seen this at other places where you get up and you go to a little stand or something that has the bread and the juice. But they encourage you to talk with each other. Once you got to that part, talk with each other. And they might, I can't remember if they gave a prompt or something, talk about, maybe it was after the sermon or lesson, talk about how this applies or something. Talk about how Jesus' sacrifice ties into this. So there was a little bit of a group dynamic there, that we're doing it together. And then after, people talked a little bit, we took it. So, again, anything we do, unless it is coming out of a meal, is going to be different than the New Testament. It's just a thought, how do we, but you can't deny they had a group dynamic. How do we try to recapture that? Because, the basis for all this I've said is, in this sermon series, it's, if God said to do something, I'm going to assume he had a reason. Again, the same way we do with baptism. We just make a very clear point. God had a reason for saying immerse, and when other people say, yeah, what's the big deal? Well, ask God. So if we see a practice, and for communion, there was a very clear group dynamic. I don't know why God said it, other than that the group dynamic is the essence of Scripture. I mean, certainly, you see this unity and fellowship all throughout, and definitely Jesus' prayer. I pray that they may be one. Well, gee, maybe taking communion with a group dynamic is part of being one. So that's where I come from on all this. If God had a reason for saying it, he knows what he's doing. Now, we have to determine for sure what he's saying, but I think it's very clear there was a group dynamic. All right, I'm going to close with prayer. You guys have endured this enough. That's the other thing. I don't think in the New Testament, I doubt their services were an hour. So, if you want to have that group dynamic, it's hard to maintain the American Christian, get them in, get them out. So I appreciate you being part of that.